Welcome to Global Perspectives. What do you know about LGBT issues around the world? Michael Luongo, a writer and the author of 15 books, has a global perspective on the issue.
Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to the show, Michael.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
My gosh, I don't know where to start because you've been everywhere, something like close to 100 countries. And
90, only 90.
Only 90, and you've written 15 books. But well, why don't you start with where one of your favorite places was, and how did you get into this subject matter?
Okay. So I write on a bunch of topics internationally. So I write on tourism. I also write a lot on LGBT issues. And I think that's going to be one of the main things that we cover in this interview. I've always loved to travel and explore new places and different places. Among my favorite places is Argentina. And I lived there doing the Frommer's Buenos Aires and Frommer's Argentina books and writing on many other topics. And in terms of LGBT issues, what I find fascinating about that country was watching it change over time from the year 2000 when I first was there, 2010 when same-sex marriage came into place, to much of what you see now. In the course of that time, watching the Gay Pride Parade, which would begin in the shadows of Catedral Metropolitana, the Metropolitan Cathedral, famous for Bergoglio, now Pope Francis, and watching Catholic thugs who used to sort of harass the people going to the parade and participating in the parade. Can we say that Bergoglio was exactly behind that? I don't know, but it was people who surrounded his church and harassed the gay people in the parade. To a time by 2010, once the same-sex marriage law was put into place, where those Catholic thugs were no longer there harassing because the church hadn't won that fight, to 2013 when Bergoglio becomes Pope Francis, and it's fascinating to think, I know a pope, so that was quite fascinating. So Argentina remains one of my favorite places. I don't live there every other year like I used to, but I still love going back and seeing the changes throughout the country, in particular on LGBT issues.
So you knew the Pope before he was the Pope.
I knew the Pope.
How would you say he was then versus the way he is now?
So I can't say that I know him well. What I used to do was photograph what's called Noche Buena, or Midnight Mass, every year that I lived there. And that's how I knew him, would briefly say hello, Merry Christmas, things like that. I have to be honest that I was somewhat repulsed on first meeting him because he was very anti-gay and anti-women. The church itself, the Catholic Church, declined in Argentina when he was the most powerful figure, partly because of this backwardsness on those issues. The church itself was often attacked with red paint, graffiti, because of the church's backward stance on women's issues and LGBT issues, as those were becoming more important in the country. So I felt that he was backwards on these issues. Once he became Pope, what I find very fascinating is he changed. I don't think that dogma will change and policy will necessarily change, but the dialogue has changed. So when you think of the Pope talking about, who should I be the one to judge, for example, I'm paraphrasing, I can't remember the exact quote offhand, and to bring up these issues in a way that the Vatican had never done before, you could say maybe he always had a somewhat more open view, but couldn't express it while he was in Buenos Aires, because you have to be conservative in order to become the Pope, but once you're the Pope, you don't have a boss, because you're the boss, unless you believe that there's somebody upstairs beyond that. So that's what I think is very interesting about the transformation. We have unfortunately seen that he's not so progressive on trans issues. Recently he did say that women would never be priests. So he's not as progressive as perhaps we'd like him to be, but he clearly is more progressive on these issues and having the dialogue that we didn't see with past popes at all.
Well, the women and priest issue, isn't he sort of constrained by parameters, or would he be able to push beyond those and say that women could be priests one day?
I don't know. I think that even if the Pope is the head of the Vatican is this vast structure. Catholicism is this vast 2,000-year-old structure. And somebody in Italy had once explained to me, it's like a big ship. if you're going to steer it, you have to steer it slowly. You can't make a 90-degree turn or a 180-degree turn. You can make slight changes over time, and I think that's one of the things that he is up against with the Vatican. Unfortunately, we do see that in Catholicism, these views of women just don't seem to change as much as progressives would like them to change.
Well, could you contrast for us your experience in Argentina initially with the way it was some years later?
So one of the things is that the parade in Buenos Aires is a night parade. So the parade usually takes place the first week of November. That's also when it corresponds with the beginning of spring in the Southern Hemisphere. The date also corresponds to an important date with the foundation of the first LGBT group that wouldn't have been called that almost 40 years ago in Argentina. And it's a night parade because people don't want to be seen. So it begins during the daytime in the Plaza de Mayo, which is in front of the cathedral, in front of the Casa Rosada, Evita's famous balcony, which is comparable to the White House. And that's a daytime gathering. And then as the parade progresses to the Congress building, it's as night begins to fall. And then more people come to the parade. And that's because they're afraid to be visible. So if they are going to come out, they're going to come out for a night parade. So some of the changes that you saw were 2003, the passing of the Civil Unions Bill, for example, which was groundbreaking in Latin America. Then as the topic of same-sex marriage came into play, and I think even by 2008, before that, the parade, instead of being a protest in front of the Congress building, it eventually moved to the steps of the Congress building facing out. And that in itself signified how much the government was embracing same-sex issues, that it was still a protest, but yet a protest from the steps. So the government was embracing the issue. 2010, of course, the same-sex marriage bill is passed before the United States gets same-sex marriage throughout the land. So I think when you see these progressive issues, and even writing on travel topics, sometimes for example, I'd be in a hotel for the Frommer's book, and somebody that I was interviewing just to get information about their hotel would find out, oh, he writes on LGBT issues also. And they would immediately say, oh, I want you to make sure that everybody knows that we're an LGBT inclusive hotel. And it wasn't necessarily something that you'd have space to put in every description of a hotel, but it was really fascinating to me how when people found out I also wrote on those issues, they wanted to make it very clear how open and how embracing they were of them. And I think this was a big change from 2000 when I first was there. It's still not perfect on trans issues, transgender issues, but it's getting much, much better. There's a law about transgender identity that was passed. So it's probably not so good outside of Buenos Aires in many ways, outside of some of the big cities, but we would have that same issue here in the United States and in many other progressive countries. It's still better to be in the big cities or the capital. So this change was really vast, and it was really fantastic to see it over this 15, 16-year period of covering the country.
How do you feel that the LGBT issue is being dealt with in the broad context of issues today as opposed to 15 or 20 years ago? And I'm thinking, it always seemed like it was an issue that was apart, and you would talk about LGBT issues and concerns and so forth. And I think it seems to me anyway that people are more accepting and understanding of the fact that this is just another subgroup of society, and it is affected by major problems such as human trafficking and terrorism, just like the rest of us.
So I think that we have seen, at least in the progressive West, if we want to divide the world up, but I think you're asking me internationally, not just in the United States, that this has become an issue at the forefront of our times. In the United States, what I do find fascinating is, would we have ever thought that we'd have LGBTs in the military, though some people say that's not really progression. That just means gays can go and get a gun and kill people in other parts of the world too, so is that really progress? But the notion of these very conservative, masculine institutions, if you want to say they're feminine or masculine, and give them that kind of an identity. Embracing LGBT issues is really, I mean, just fantastically changing from 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's interesting to think that Don't Ask, Don't Tell was supposed to be sort of a progressive thing that Clinton put into place, but it was really actually very non-progressive, and now we've overcome that. The idea of same-sex marriage, the idea of the White House being lit up in rainbow colors to celebrate that same-sex marriage became the law of the land is incredible. I think in terms of international policy, when you see that the UN has now created an office on these issues, a person who's dedicated to those issues. You have groups like Eagle Herc, which is now called Outright International, which is the one group that's working directly with the UN on these issues. The whole notion of it becoming part of US foreign policy in dealing with other countries, having interviewed people in part of our embassy in Riga, Latvia, where there was Europride, for example, in 2015, it's also that LGBT issues become part of public policy and also show how different the progressive West is on these issues versus, say, as we know, Putin and Russia, where this becomes this very negative stance, oppressive stance, and how it's used in his foreign policy to create conservatism and perhaps chaos in the former Soviet sphere, and LGBTs are among the people that are sort of sacrificed for this, for getting influence. So you see both the negative and the positive in the international sphere. But you also see in countries, in Africa, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, which are less progressive. So Uganda, for example, with the Kill the Gays bill, as it's called, where people now bring up that dealing with you as a country will be difficult because of this bill. And maybe 5, 10, 15 years ago, nobody would have brought this up. You do see also that LGBT issues were part of the first part of the Arab Spring, when it began as a secular movement, a very progressive middle-class movement. Unfortunately, it's been quite decimating to LGBT issues. But at the same time, in our own foreign policy, we sacrifice LGBT issues sometimes in dealing with the Arab Spring. So Egypt has become terribly repressive, as one of the worst countries now on LGBT issues. But we don't even bring that up anymore because we want a stable Egypt post-Arab Spring. So it is part of our foreign policy, but it's also part of our foreign policy when it makes sense for the United States. And perhaps in Egypt, we don't have that view necessarily. But the idea that these issues can be brought up at the UN, at the World Bank, at these global institutions is something that was unimaginable 5, 10, 15 years ago.
Well, when you travel and people find out that you're writing on LGBT issues, does that affect your personal safety and security? And have you ever believed that you were in danger?
Yes. So sometimes when I'm writing on LGBT issues, I don't always make it clear that I myself am gay. I think some people can figure that out. At times, if they just simply Google me or look me up, they can find that out. Sometimes I'm very clear that I am. It can depend on the interview. It can depend on the circumstances. It can also depend on how much I need to protect the person that I'm interviewing. Because people who come to me with these topics, with these, they themselves are often at risk. So it's not so important to me whether I'm at risk, but whether my behavior and my actions put other people at risk. Yes, this has happened in Iraq, for example, with the phone being tapped. This was a terrible problem for somebody that I was interviewing, and he called me in a panic because he got a phone call after he had called me. It has been a problem for me even in the United States in doing talks on the book Gay Travels in the Muslim World, where I did an event at a college in New York where I thought I was happy to see some people in the audience who later tried to shut down the event, and I had to walk By myself back, you think it's Manhattan, but to the subway, and what happened at the talk was on my mind as I walked the several blocks to the subway. But so it can really be in many different places that I am at risk, but sometimes the risk would be that way for any journalist covering conflict. So being fired at and having missiles shot at you when you're at a checkpoint in Baghdad, for example, which has nothing to do with covering LGBT issues. You're just in a war zone. So,
What are some places you haven't yet visited that you'd like to go to?
I have not been to sub-Saharan Africa. Unfortunately, it's a terrible hole in my experience that I've just simply, my travels and my journalism have not taken me there. So that's definitely a place that I want to visit. And again, because some of these LGBT issues and just they're beautiful parts of the world that you want to see. I don't know Far East Asia or East Asia very well. I haven't been to China, I haven't been to Japan, I haven't been to Korea. So that's another area that I don't know of the world as much that I'd love to cover. Most people do view me as a Middle East and Latin America expert in terms of international issues. More recently, I have been doing stuff on Eastern Europe. Found out my uncle was a resistance fighter against the Nazis, went with him to Poland for a commemoration, then went the next year to Riga and Latvia to cover this Europride, the first in a former Soviet republic. So I don't know Eastern Europe as well as I'd like to, but that's another area where I'm beginning to learn a lot more about.
What is your reaction to some of the unspeakable violence that has occurred against the LGBT community, or they just happen to get wrapped up in it because that was the target of a perpetrator, including the Pulse nightclub tragedy in Orlando?
So I think that LGBT people, we remain among the most vulnerable group in the United States, internationally. Even as the world progresses, we're the easiest to pick on and use religion against or use this concept of morals against. You have terrible places in the world of Syria and Iraq under ISIS where men are being pushed off buildings. So there's this very specific anti-gay violence that's going on there. You had in Egypt the Nile boat incident 15 years ago, with government repression against gays. The Pulse nightclub event, I think that we would think in America that when we have same-sex marriage, when we have gays in the military, the idea of somebody coming in to shoot up a nightclub is just unfathomable. I know there's still debates about is this radical terrorism, is this homophobia, is this anti-Latino? It was also a Latin night. But Omar Mateen specifically drove to that nightclub, and there's a reason for that. And there's a reason why he targeted a gay nightclub. And you cannot argue that it was because it was full of LGBT people. So even in our own country, we are vulnerable. And are we vulnerable because of radical terrorism? Or are we vulnerable also because of gun rights, gun laws, or just that any crazy person can come into a club and shoot up? But LGBT people will remain vulnerable no matter how progressive the world gets. And I think, having been here in Florida these past few days speaking with people, the only good that's come out of Pulse is that some people who were very anti-gay within the Florida government have now begun to change their stance, have begun to see that LGBT people are very vulnerable, and the dialogue that you put out against LGBT people can create this violence. So I think the notion that people are having this better understanding of how dialogue creates violence is the good, quote unquote, that comes out of this incident. But unfortunately, you see this violence throughout the world.
You do, and in this country, there's always, going back to the beginning, that there was second-class status for women, for minorities, and so it just makes sense that the LGBT community would be part of that today. But over time, it seems that we have made progress. So do you foresee a moment in the future, I don't know if it's going to take 25 years or 50 years, when we would reach a situation where we just have a single standard for all citizens, regardless of preferences, gender, et cetera, et cetera?
It would be nice to think that it would be that way. I think that people who are part of diversity, and diversity broadly, will always be a component of diversity. I think that full equality is obtainable. So look, same-sex marriage is great, but what good is it to be married if you can't get a job and you can't get housing? So we celebrate this achievement, and it is an achievement, but why have a husband or a wife who's unemployed and homeless? So we don't have full rights yet throughout the country. And that is something that still needs to be achieved. And how long will it take for that to be achieved? But even when that is achieved, components of diversity, we have laws to protect people who are black. We have laws to protect people who are Jewish. But at the same time, we still have all these problems for people who are black, who are Jewish. You know, having a black president didn't necessarily mean that all of a sudden there was no discrimination against black people in this country. And in fact, it brought out a lot of people who are crazy from the, you know, who were very vehemently anti-black and now express it more openly because there's a black president. So I think that we will continue to progress, but we will still always have these negative forces, these backwards forces, but we'll also have diversity sensitivity will always be necessary. So if I'm from New York, which is a very diverse place, then I'm around a lot of people who are different. But if I go to a Midwestern part of the country, I'm currently living in Ann Arbor, which is a lot less diverse, then maybe there are some people who never went to high school with black people, who never ever met a Latino in their lives. So you have throughout the country still this need for diversity sensitivity, even if full equality is reached for everyone and there's no such thing as a second-class citizen.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And I guess I was asking that question looking for the ideal, but at the same time I'm cognizant of the fact that American society has in many ways gotten very ugly, very coarse, very unpleasant, and as you said, people seem to have been inspired to actually reveal their preferences in very, very public ways. And then you wonder, oh my gosh, you know, I didn't think that such a large percentage of the population felt that way, was prejudiced, or however you want to term it. So how do we reconcile those? I mean, you're reaching for the ideal, but then you've got a lot of people who seem to be mired in the past in terms of very, very limited, intolerant perspectives.
Or believe in right-wing repression or militarization. I'll give you a story from overseas, from Chile. So I was sitting in a hotel speaking with a young man who had a new baby. He was the manager of the hotel. And we're going on and on and on about the baby, and he's showing me pictures and how happy he is to have the baby. It's this wonderful family moment that he's talking about. Then he suddenly starts talking about Pinochet and how he wishes it was back, and he wishes, you know, what does it matter that 3,000 people died? We have a great economy. And I think in the United States now, you see people who believe in these same kinds of things, that we need to repress certain people, we need to have a society that's more divided. You may be speaking with somebody and not realize that they're a horrific racist. They may think that because you're white, you would believe in the same things that they do. So it is shocking to me sometimes the things that you find out, and you may be having these happy conversations about a baby, and then suddenly these horrific things that people think come out after that. I think that every time a society progresses, you always will get this backlash. And I think that, you know, we see it against LGBT people. We certainly see it against black people. And I think that it's been among the worst things against black people. And this militarization of our police force becoming something like what you would see in dictatorships under Pinochet, but, you know, but individually in different communities in different cities. And people think this is a good thing, that you just go and point blank kill people. It's something that we will always continue to see. the country is much more polarized than it ever was. I think an interesting statistic that I'd seen, and Michael Bloomberg actually in his speech to University of Michigan for graduation, he brought up the statistic that more Americans are in favor of same-sex marriage than they are in favor of Republicans and Democrats marrying each other. So you find that's part of this polarization also in the United States. So we will always, unfortunately, have this.
And Michael, we're unfortunately out
Yeah.
of time, so we want to thank you very much for joining us
Thank you
today.
for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks.
And thank you for Global Perspectives. I'm John Bercia, and we'll see you next time.